Well, we've reached episode 12 of my series Making the Changes, which is focused on the key skill of using chord tones, so arpeggios, to outline the chord changes as they change. A key foundational skill for both your fretboard knowledge, your ear, and also just laying good groundwork for improvising. Now, to help bring this together and kind of help you with your future use of arpeggios for improvising, I thought what would be most useful in this final installment is to think about 10 considerations for how you take this forward in your playing for the long term. First point, why did I stick with the same song for the whole series? Why didn't I change it up 1 month to the next and try, I don't know, All the Things You Are or Blue Bossa? Well, the key reason I didn't do that is I wanted to illustrate the value in sticking with a standard for a long term. The benefits of doing this, if you stick it with one song or several songs, is that you internalize the sound of the chord changes. They go beyond being just, okay, it's A minor 7 to D7 and following a chart to, if I play A minor 7, I don't need to play the D7 to know what it's going to sound like. It's no surprise to me. I can hear the G major 7. I'm so familiar with that Autumn Leaves A section. It's unconsciously up here. And that's critical. If you're going to improvise over chord changes, you don't want to be thinking about what chord's coming next or not know the sound of the next chord. That's just got to be unconscious. And that only happens if you play a song for a long enough period of time. So one thing for your long-term development is the songs you really want to learn to play over well, you need to practice them for the long term and keep them as part of your practice routine. Because if you can't internalize the sound of the chords, I think it becomes impossible to play a line you start which goes from one chord to the next. You're always going to play something on one chord, then something on the next chord, and so forth, and it's going to be very broken up. Second point, chords won't always move in the predictable way that they do in Autumn Leaves. I deliberately picked Autumn Leaves for the focus of this series because the chords move in fourths, which is very common of jazz standards. It also gave us the opportunity to do things like the flat 7 to 3 resolve, or the round midnight lick. That between A minor 7 and D7. But you're going to get songs with less predictable movements where you get chords from different keys and so forth. Say, for example, Out of Nowhere. Starts on G major 7, the tonic chord, then goes to a 2-5 in A flat. So it goes to B flat minor 7, E flat 7. So that's going to be very different. But what I'd encourage you to do is, try this approach on different songs, but try and resolve your arpeggios to the nearest note. So if I went up G major 7 there, the nearest note of B flat minor would be this F underneath. Something like that. So you need to try it with other songs. Not all songs are going to have the predictable movements of fourths like Autumn Leaves, and it's a question of learning how to use arpeggios in those different scenarios. The third point, which is really about progressing into more kind of intermediate advanced territory, is that the names of the chords could almost be irrelevant, and that the key is in the intervals. So say, for instance, if I play 1, 3, 5, 7, 3 over these first two chords, A minor 7 and D7, like that. If I did that in another key, like say I did it in starting on C minor 7, that's C minor 7 to F7. Let's do it starting on an E minor. I think you'd agree that all sounds the same, right? Obviously it's maybe higher, lower in that sense of the notes, but it's the same musical ingredients. So one thing that's imperative to save yourself doing lots of extra work is to learn that it's about intervals. Yes, it is important to know the notes, know your chord names and everything like that. But in the long run, let's say you should get to the point where you could play Autumn Leaves in another key because you're so familiar with the sound movements. Going back, what I said in point 1, the internalization of the sound of the chords. Whether you play in the key we've looked at it or like that, it's the same thing to me, and that cuts down a lot of work because those intervals, those chord movements and so forth, you could then play Autumn Leaves in any key. And I suppose what I'm saying is, as you get more used to doing this and you get more used to the sound of the intervals and you internalize that side of things, those things, it shouldn't be a big step to say, get iReal open, put Autumn Leaves into a random key and see if you can play the chord tones. It's you're searching after the same kind of sounds, right? Fourth point, making the changes, playing the changes, whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean you have to play every chord change. if you've got a 2-5-1 in G major, so A minor 7, D7, G major 7, well, you don't have to play something against every chord. You could just play. There I just played something on the 2 and the 1. I ignored the D7 altogether. Or I could ignore the A minor 7 and just play on the D7 to the G. So I don't feel the need to play every chord and fill all the space. Feel like you can sometimes ignore a chord or two. Point 5, if I don't know the changes to a song, I don't expect to be able to improvise well over it with regular kind of consistent results, if you like. So what I mean by that is, learning a song is a journey. You start from the bottom and work your way up, obviously, and over time you get more familiar with it. But if I don't know the changes, if I can't play the chords, if I don't know the sound of the chords, as I said, internalized it, then I'm not going to play over it well. And I would just say, when it comes to being able to apply the skill, don't be hard on yourself if you find you can't do it against a song, unless you know the chords off by heart. You don't need a sheet to do it. The sound of the chords, like I said, you've internalized the sound and the movements of the chords, probably the melody as well. And if you've got those things in place, you should then be able to, use your arpeggios to navigate those chord changes. But if I don't know the changes, if I don't know them, then this is, it feels really unfamiliar. So it's just, obviously there's typical progressions which I know repeat in songs like 2-5-1s, 1-6-2-5s, but songs to me are more than just 2-5-1s and 1-6-2-5s. They have meaning and a purpose. So what you want to try to do is apply this to songs you know well, and remember that you really do need to do a lot of groundwork with a song to get to the point where you can play the changes. Point 6, to see how you're getting on with arpeggios and being able to make changes, like you should be able to play a chord like A minor 7 here and sing the arpeggio without needing to play it. So I can play the chord, da, da, da. And then if you can do that, you've internalized the sound of the individual notes of the chords. And then it's being able to trying to sing, that was a bit lame, but trying to sing some line. If you can get to that point, then you've internalized the sound of the arpeggio, and us, the instrument, can create a line that we can then find on our instrument. So important to be able to do that. Play a chord, sing the arpeggio. If you can do that, maybe you can try singing a line and finding it on the instrument. That might actually be more useful than jumping to just say backing track straight away, and just doing things at a time, playing a chord or two, singing lines, kind of led by the arpeggio with obviously other ingredients along the way. Point 7 is you should, and I'm sure a lot of you do be doing a hell of a lot of listening. The listening is as important as the practice, the physical time with your instrument. So what you're listening for is to how people navigate changes, how they make the changes, or sometimes not, deliberately when they're playing. And that will expose you to jazz language, which will, subconsciously rub off on you as you listen to it enough, and it will come out in one way or another as you evolve as a guitar player. Which brings me to the next point, which is transcribing, like taking a section of a solo, might even be 4 bars, might be a whole chorus, whatever, and transcribing it and working it out. Not just playing it, but doing it from a position of knowing what they're doing. So using your knowledge of arpeggios and maybe scales as well to help you understand. And I'll tell you why, because this will help you see how people do make the changes. The amount of time that I transcribe a solo and go, it's just 1-3-5 there. It's just all 1-3-5. And you just get it so often. And it's often in the case they're using these basic chord tones, but it's the rhythm and the way they phrase them that make them sound interesting. But if you were to pair what you've learnt through the series of these videos with analysing jazz solos and language and seeing how people use chord tones in solos, then that will really help you learn to, borrow some of their ideas and imitate them and take these chord tones into more phrasing kind of based ideas. Point 9 is a bit of a bugbear of mine. It's a lot of people will tell you not to practice scales and arpeggios. Now, because they will say, well, I just practice licks or practice jazz language. And I get that approach too, those approaches. But quite often the people that are saying these things, they know their scales and arpeggios really well. And maybe when they're soloing, it's all unconscious, and they don't realise they're tapping into a lot of these things, or they don't give them credit. Those kind of things help you learn to navigate the fretboard, to train your ear, to develop technique, all key things, foundations. And I think a lot of people give out advice and they don't acknowledge how all this foundational stuff sits and has worked and helped them get to where they are. So you'll find often they get a bad rep, arpeggios and scales, but most often than not, if you ask that person, so do you know your scales? Do you know your arpeggios? They'd be like, oh yeah, no, I've practiced them for hours, I've practiced them for years. So I always think that's a peculiar point about jazz education. Point 10, the final point, is thank you for sticking with this series for this long, because I think it illustrates a problem a lot of people have with studying music, jazz guitar, whatever musical endeavour, and that is actually just sticking with something. In this day and age, we get bombarded with so many different things. To actually stick with an approach means that you have something you can build upon. And if you're jumping from one thing to the next, then things aren't very useful, and it can be hard to bring things together in a coherent way to help you progress. So I think that's the important thing, is sticking with things. You stick with learning your arpeggios and learning to apply them and make the changes as we've been doing in different ways, then that is a long-term skill that in the long run, as I say, it's such a key foundation for your ear, your fretboard knowledge. It will really give you a solid foundation for soloing. Which just brings me to say, thanks as ever for tuning in. Please do leave a comment if you've enjoyed this series. I'm thinking about continuing it next year, maybe going into some of the topics I've mentioned today, so leave me a comment if you'd like me to do that. I'm currently working on a Making the Changes practice book, which is designed to give you exercises to sit down and apply these skills against other standards and so forth. So if you want to be informed about that, make sure you're on my email list. I'll link to that in the description below. But thanks as ever for your support this year. Hope you've enjoyed the series. I really enjoyed putting the videos together. It was actually nice to work on a series of videos around the same topic rather than kind of disparate videos, which often linked but not in such a obvious way. Thanks again. Until next time, you take care.